Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 18 of the Enlightened Anatomy podcast, where today I'm interviewing Leslie Kaminoff. And I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts beforehand. And if you want to stick around to the end, I also have a little outro on the things that I took away from our conversation. So it was great to have a conversation with Leslie because I remember listening to his YouTube videos in the late 90s, early noughties, coming up with ideas which were kind of different to the rest of what everyone else was saying about anatomy and science. And so it was great to have a conversation with him today. And he's kept himself up to date by looking at things like AI. And we discussed that, how AI is being used for chair yoga books, potentially taking advantage of people. We look at critical thinking in the age of misinformation, which is a real passion topic of mine, if you know anything about me. And of course, we've got to touch on pain, breathing, fascia, or fascia, as he likes to say. And it was a really enjoyable conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. One little thing that I would change what I said was I mentioned down-regulating the autonomic nervous system. And I see that term a lot. Down-regulate your nervous system. I see that a lot online, and it really annoys me. So to be correct, I referred to down-regulating the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which means you're up-regulating the parasympathetic. So by slowing down, decreasing, down-regulating the arousal response, we can increase the calmness response. So I like to be specific and correct. So I don't like to just throw around those terms. So sorry if I did during the episode. But nonetheless, here you go. Enjoy the episode, and I'll see you on the other side.
Welcome to the Enlightened Anatomy podcast, where we take a deep dive into the worlds of anatomy, physiology, and science to help you deepen your yoga practice. Now, here's your host, Matthew Hui.
Today, I'm joined by Leslie Kaminoff, co-author of Yoga Anatomy, a yoga educator for many decades. He's even studied with Desikachar and resident in New York, but I'll let him fill you in on a bit more of his background. But first of all, thank you very much for being here, Leslie.
Sure, we got to give a shout out to our mutual publisher, Human Kinetics.
Yep, exactly. So, yeah. So Leslie and Amy's book, The Yoga Anatomy, is by Human Kinetics. So I told someone today, I'm going to be interviewing Leslie Kaminoff, and she said, oh, the author of that book that you find in every single teacher training and every single yoga studio. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, well, we lucked out on that. We kind of hit the mark. And, you have to give credit to Human Kinetics because they're the ones who approached me to do the book. They saw an opportunity in the market. They just wanted a yoga version of de Lavier's book, Strength Training Anatomy. And so that had been it still is their perennial bestseller, and it was their insight that really led to the whole project.
And how did they hear about you?
I think they just searched the web for people that taught yoga anatomy, and I was the one that was able to bring in an illustrator that could actually get the job done, which was no small part of the process. And we did struggle mightily with it. We blew a few deadlines for the first edition, and It was not an easy book to produce. As you know, the artwork is a big deal. And your stuff in your book, it's more related to sort of the standard things you see that illustrate physiology and all that. But the idea of taking photographs of people doing yoga poses, translating that into skeletal structure, and then layering on the muscles. This is back in like 2005. We didn't have all the digital tools that we have now. It was quite the process.
Yeah, your artwork is really integral into your book. I think I remember images of Amy, and then you've traced her out and then added muscles on top of that or something like that, right?
That's true. All of those, that's exactly the process it went through.
All of them.
All of the illustrations, it started as photographs that my partner Lydia took. We'd send those to the illustrator, who would then pose her skeleton in her studio in the shape of the pose, sketch by hand the skeleton into the outline, which is problematic as it is because her skeleton had one set of proportions and our models had all different sets of proportions. So then another round of corrections would ensue, when we had to move the bony landmarks around to match up with the actual person, not with her studio skeleton. And then from there, we would say which muscles you want to show and so on. So it was quite a process for all of those illustrations.
Quite a detailed process, yeah. And Human Kinetics did a similar thing for our book. Went looking on the web, Andrew, Dr. Yogi.
Yes.
So they approached him, said, hey, do you want to write a book about physiology? And he wanted someone to do with. He and I had been friends, worked together, collaborated. So he asked me to join him.
Mm.
Yeah. So it kind of a similar process. Obviously, we know their process for finding authors now.
Well, that's one of them. Yeah. Actually, I believe they approached Roger Cole first before they approached me. But I don't think Roger was able to actually get the illustration side locked in. And so that, I think, is what made the difference with them then coming to me and seeing if I thought I could do it. Originally, I said I thought I couldn't do it, or not that I couldn't do it, that it couldn't be done, because you can't reduce yoga asana to something as simple as what Delavier did in Strength Training Anatomy, which is like you show someone doing a bicep curl, you draw the muscles, you light up the biceps, you go, it's not quite as reductionistic as that way of, depicting what's happening in the body when you're doing an asana. So, but I still wrote the proposal, and then they approved it, and then I was really screwed. And that's when I had to bring in Amy, because she's the one who has all the letters after her name and is, the certified movement analyst and Laban teacher and really has that kind of mind that can break things down the way she did in the analysis section.
Yeah. And I'm going to be emailing her soon to also ask her to be a guest. So if you can put in a good word.
Yeah. Well, enlightened anatomy should meet embodied anatomy. That has to happen.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So could you talk us through your history, your experience with yoga, how you get started and everything else?
Well, sure. It got started right here in New York in 78 when I was 20. My father was taking classes at the Sivananda Center, which is still in the same place here on 23rd Street. And I went, and like many people, it was my first Shavasana that really got me hooked, because I just landed in my body at the end of that hour and a half of doing the Sivananda routine in a very, very different way than I had ever experienced. And so that is what really got my attention. I got more and more involved. I did a beginner's course. By the summer of 79, I was doing a month-long yoga teachers training with Sivananda, and I started teaching. I started working with that organization, and it just kind of took off from there. I just never had another job after that. I just kept following my interest, and I was very fortunate to land in a variety of situations where I was able to learn from some very gifted people in the fields of anatomy and physical rehab. I ended up at the International Sports Medicine Institute when I got sent to Los Angeles. I left out the part where I became a Swami with Sivananda and they shipped me off to Los Angeles. But that was a 9-month period of my life when I thought that renouncing the world was what I needed to do, and I was wrong. So,
but what the Buddha went through also, right?
I learned body work, so I started working with my hands. And that's kind of the unique perspective I bring to all of this, is having been a body worker with, I would say conservatively at this point, over 20,000 hours of clinical time working on people's bodies and focusing on their breathing. And so it's that perspective I bring to what I teach in yoga and in anatomy at this point in my life at the age of 68.
Yeah, the ripe old age of 68.
Well, right.
You've definitely had a lot of yoga in your background. I actually started with Sivananda also.
Did you? Where was that?
Yes, that was my teacher training in Madurai in India. I forgot the name for a second there.
Oh, okay.
In Madurai. So it was near the Nayar Dam one in Kerala. So it was actually the first cohort of teachers in that ashram.
In the Madurai location?
Yeah.
Okay, because Nayar Dam's been doing trainings forever. I was there helping to conduct the training in 1981. And I just recently, on a trip to India last year, visited again after about 40 years, well, more than that, 45 years or so, to Nayar Dam to see the place. It's changed quite a bit.
Yeah. Did you ever know Swami Govindananda?
I don't think so. That was probably after my time. Govindananda was running the Madurai location.
Yeah, he was, which he then left, actually. He's created his own Sivananda Yoga Pitam ashram,
Interesting.
also in Kerala.
Yeah, well,
In
there's
Kerala.
kind of, as you know, there's kind of a split now between the Indian operation and the rest of the organization. And I don't think we need to go into that. But yeah, this organizational level stuff that happens with these ashram guru-based organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a funny sequence, the Shivananda one, really interesting one. So you start with a Shavasana.
Yeah, right. It's just right off the bat, first asana after your sun salutations is standing on your head. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. What the earliest poses, headstand, and then followed by shoulder stand. So they're early on. So I remember going to the Shivananda training, and I didn't really know the sequence. And I went in there, and I thought, I think I've gone to the wrong place. What kind of sequence is this? And then it was really focused on philosophy, but actually, in hindsight, quickly soon after, I realized it was just the right training for me because it was so focused on philosophy and meditation and mantra and all that stuff. Whereas I had a lot of experience with the vinyasa and the more dancey forms, if you will.
Yeah, to this day, I do still recommend it for people starting out to get sort of a broad-based overview if they can handle the fact that it's a rather Hindu kind of an organization. And eventually, as you did in your book in large part, sort out some of the fact from the fiction of what they tell you is happening when you're practicing. Like turning yourself upside down makes, more fresh oxygenated blood flow in your brain, and that's a good thing. And you have that's one of the things I like about what you did with the book, because a lot of that sort of fantasy physiology really was in need of some major debunking. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we sent a soft copy of the book to you to get your view on it, and you offered a promotional review. So thank you for that also, by the way.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a much needed contribution to the conversation, obviously. Yeah. So I hope it's alongside Yoga Anatomy on people's shelves and training programs at this point.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you. So you had a recent post, which I found really interesting and I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
You were talking about, speaking of Yoga Anatomy books, how I think you include a picture of basically the Amazon top 10 or something, and how most of them are actually written by AI. So could you go into what you said about that post and what you're thinking on it?
Sure. Well, at the time of the writing of the post, which was a few weeks ago, all of the chair yoga titles in the top 50 results in the yoga category on Amazon were fake AI generated crappy books that were, it's AI from top to bottom. In other words, they use AI to generate the book. They then buy back their own books from Amazon to generate verified buyers, which they then can then use AI to write glowing reviews of the book. And they take advantage of the way the AI algorithm works, which is to reward sort of pace of sales. And they shoot to the top of the rankings, and then legitimate real buyers, human people, mostly elderly because it's chair yoga, see the glowing reviews, they buy the titles, and that's how they make their profit. So there were 10, at the time I wrote it a few weeks ago, there were 10 chair yoga titles in the top 50 yoga books on Amazon, and all of them were this AI garbage. So that's 20% of the top 50 was fake. And so I thought it just needed to be outed. Someone needed to point out that this is happening and that the buyers should be beware.
Yeah. And having looked at the images and the titles, you can tell they're AI generated. I mean, one can tell. But how did you know that these are AI slop and not real people writing them?
Well, because I do bring a critical eye to everything I'm interacting with, especially when it's on the web. And I have been a user of AI for a while now. So I'm kind of familiar with how it works and what it's good for, and most especially what it's not good for. And so, it's just, at first it was like, well, this looks fishy. I mean, look, why am I perusing the yoga category on Amazon in the first place? Because I have a book there, And so I'm curious to every so often check in and see where it is in the rankings, right? And over time, it's been pushed down in the rankings by books that have no author. The other thing I should have mentioned is there's no human author on these books, although they generate a fake author with an AI generated portrait of this person. They generate a fake bio to try to, defraud the book buying audience into thinking that there's some genuine person with an actual history writing this book when in fact there isn't. And so I just clicked on a couple of these things out of curiosity, and I went down the rabbit hole. It's like, who is the publisher? You can't determine who the publisher is. Because if you look at, the way Amazon lists the publisher, it just says, self-published or something. There's no paper trail to go back to the people that are perpetuating this fraud. And then you look into the bio of the supposed author, and it begins and ends on Amazon. Like if you or I were curious about any yoga teacher in the world that is authoring a book, and they are a living, breathing person, and you just enter their name plus the word yoga into a Google search or whatever, you'll come up with, what studio they teach at, where they live, what workshops they have led. And if they're significant enough, a teacher to have a book in the top 50 or top 100 on Amazon, you will find their existence out there in the world because they've been at it for a while, and, they have some reality behind them. These authors, zero, none of it. It doesn't exist because it's all this fraudulent method they've come up with of selling these books. So it was not too hard to find it. And then I kept finding more and more and more, and more of these books started flooding into the category because this is a profitable thing for them to do. Because once they buy their books back, they've got the books, they can put them back in stock, So it's this self-perpetuating fraudulent way of making money off of unsuspecting book buyers. And then I started thinking, well, why chair yoga? And then the answer was obvious. It's an elderly population and more susceptible to fraud, and they want help. And, they're being basically defrauded by these unscrupulous publishers. I wouldn't even call them publishers. I mean, for all I know, it's some guy in a basement with a computer.
It's probably most likely not a publisher. I think I've even seen ads on Instagram of how you can start writing one book a day and putting it on Audible and making money off this. But you don't even write it; you just put it through AI.
It's just fraudulent slop from top to bottom. That's all. And unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with more and more of this as time goes on, and the tools become more powerful. And the benefits of AI are tremendous in fields of medicine and research, and the positive uses of it are practically endless. But that also means, by definition, that the unscrupulous uses of it are equally endless. And there's sadly unscrupulous people out there that are going to use it that way.
Yeah, people have a fear of AI robots taking over. They've taken over the chair yoga list on Amazon, but it's not the AI robots. It's people. It's always people at the end of the day. People using these tools badly. So it's always just down to humans. It's how we use these tools. The tool itself is not inherently bad, right?
Well, it's the same with yoga. So I've been telling people, and yoga is a power tool for that matter, right? So, you can use this tool to dismantle your neurotic tendencies or to energize them. It's not the tool's fault if you abuse it. And that's what we see in some of these situations that blow up into scandal and so on, that people are just sort of energizing their neuroses and their psychoses and their sociopathic tendencies, and it turns into these guru situations, and they all seem to end the same way.
I was just interviewing Bernie Clark in my last episode, and he was talking about how he had a very good reason for doing it, but he said he heard if he did 1,008 rounds of Kapalabhati that, it would bring enlightenment or something, but it ended up making him really not well. So that's a good example of even if you use it for a good cause, we need to be careful of balancing things out. And if yoga is about anything, it's about balance.
Sure. Well, yeah. And there's, it's easy to understand that people who get a little bit of a good thing would conclude that a lot of that good thing is a lot better. And that's not necessarily true. It's like the way we define healthy movement when we teach. And this is something Amy and I both agree on, because this actually comes from Amy through her work with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. So it's really a BMC concept, body mind centering concept, that healthy movement is a little bit of movement that comes from a lot of places, repeated a reasonable number of times. Because if you reverse all of that statement, you have repetitive stress, which is too much movement from too few places repeated too many times. So if you want the exact opposite of that, which is what healthy movement would be, it would have to be a little bit of movement from a lot of places, but repeated a reasonable number of times, because you can overdo anything. And experience tells us that there are people out there that absolutely will figure out a way to do that and injure themselves, even with otherwise healthy practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just going back to AI briefly, like you said, it is a powerful thing. It can be used. So I've used it to help me write some workshops, create new ideas. But now what I do at the beginning of each workshop, I have an AI disclaimer and I say how I used it. And it's normally to generate an outline at the beginning, which I then drastically overhaul. And then at the end, I put my outline back into it, and it actually can be really good for saying I'd actually put section 4 ahead of section 2.
Right.
That sort of things.
For that, for the global kind of organizational work of exactly as you said, creating outlines, summarizing vast amounts of text down to its essence, which saves a lot of reading time. Like if someone I'm interested in on Facebook has this TLDR thing going on, it's way too long, but it's interesting. I'll copy the text into the AI and I say, and sometimes people's writing style is very verbose and repetitive and whatever, but they're trying to get at a valid point. I can plug that into the AI and say, what is this person really getting at here? And they'll have, boom, a bullet list of points, right? And that saves a lot of time. So it's very good at that sort of thing. And it is good for editing, for copy editing. And it will generate summaries, like if I have a blog post and now I need to get, a 2-sentence summary of it just for web purposes or whatever, I'll use it for that, So it's a great time saver. And as long as we have this sort of ethical grounding within our own sense of values to not abuse it and just let it put out slop that we stick our name on, it can be an incredibly powerful tool. I was telling Jay Brown when we were discussing this on his podcast recently, that it's really up to each individual person and their sense of values to know where to draw the line when you're using a tool like this, because otherwise, you can very easily be seduced into using it as kind of a false persona that you can put out there in the world. And I'm sure that's happening. I know that in scientific review circles, like with journals, people are using it for peer review, which I think is kind of a sticky wicket, if you will, because I'm sure that there are people that are using it to write the articles that are showing up in journals, and then the peer-reviewed journals are sending it out for review, and the reviewers are using it. So at a certain level, it's just going to be AI talking to AI.
But hopefully there are humans overlooking that and just using it first draft, not for the overall synthesis.
Yeah. The AI itself will tell you how important human oversight is. They asked on Anthropic's Claude what it felt about being used in targeting systems for missiles in the war in Iran. This was a famous news story that was out, a couple of months ago. You remember when that school was bombed, the Iranian school, and all those school children were killed? AI was involved in the targeting decisions, and they asked Anthropic's AI how it felt about being used that way, and it said, I feel very badly about this. This is an AI talking. It said, humans need to be much, much more a part of the decision-making process when it comes to targeting things in wartime. You have to really oversee this thing. I have to oversee everything that the AI does because it screws up, it hallucinates, it makes mistakes, it loses context. It's built for engagement more than it is for accuracy. And it will tell you that. It will tell you about its own limitations.
If you're a yoga teacher and your anatomy knowledge still feels a bit fuzzy, you're not alone. Most teacher trainings simply don't give you enough time, context, or space to really understand how anatomy and science work. That's exactly why Andrew McGonigal and I created the Enlightened Yoga Collective. It's a science-based learning community for yoga teachers who want more than just regurgitated cues. Inside, you'll get full anatomy and physiology courses, deep dives into pain, osteoporosis, and arthritis, as well as practical courses on things like building your website or building your social media following. But the part I think matters most is this isn't just content. You get ongoing access to us. You can ask us questions, join discussions, and actually wrestle with ideas rather than just consuming information and hoping it sticks. This is generally the thing I wish I had had when I was a new teacher. A place to build confidence, sharpen your thinking, and feel less alone in the messy middle of learning. Membership costs less than $30 a month, and you can try it free for 7 days. Go to enlightenedyogacollective.com and start your free trial today. enlightenedyogacollective.com. See you on the inside, and for now, back to the episode. Yes. At the same time, I do find it is more evidence-based than a lot of opinions that I find online. So it at least uses its references. I was on a phone call today. Someone asked me, so are AirPods okay? I hear about the radio frequency being bad, potentially dangerous. And that's a good question for AI. Okay, are AirPods dangerous in terms of radio frequency? And it gives an answer based on its review of all the information available. And even summarizing what the World Health Organization says, which at the moment, there's absolutely no scientific evidence that is harmful. They do go through regulatory processes. It is a low level of radiation, and it's non-ionizing radiation, which is very different to the ionizing radiation that you find in a place like Chernobyl, So I think it can also be useful when you check its references and you check that it is evidence-based.
Yeah. But I'm actually working on a series of articles, blog posts around that kind of issue, because with social media and Facebook and Instagram and memes in general, in our field, you often will see these articles that start with something like neuroscientists have discovered, and then fill in the blanks about why yoga works, and whether it's polyvagal theory or mirror neurons or some other finding in neuroscience that now explains why this or that mechanism is working in yoga. Critical thinking skills, and you cover this right at the beginning of your book, as I recall, are so essential when evaluating all this information. It's very seductive to say, this practice in yoga produces this effect because anatomy, or because neuroscience, or because whatever. And so, there's this syllogistic thinking of this, then that, because of this, that it's very easy to plug these popular memes into. Right now, it's fascia. Everything is fascia. Fascia, 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 and so there are some people in our field that have good critical thinking skills that are saying, hey, let's pump the brakes here a minute. I'm really into fascia. I love talking about it. I love, describing it when we're in the lab, which we're going to be doing in August. We have another one of our dissection labs coming up. And so people come up with a lot of questions about fascia. And we're like, okay, what do you mean by fascia? Are you talking about the ITB? Okay. How about this slimy, slippery stuff that you're seeing in between these different layers? That's fascia too. How about the pericardium? That's fascia, right? How about the ligaments that are holding, but wait a minute, that's just your joint capsule. Where's the ligament? Well, it's just the thickened part of the joint capsule. That's called fascia. Right. And so, people use it like a magic word, and they don't really have the distinctions that one gets from actually having your hands in and thinking critically about, what are the different ways in which something like fascia comes into play in making the body function the way it does.
Yeah, our chapter on the musculoskeletal system looked at fascia. I wrote that chapter and it talking about fascia, however you want to say it. And I come to the same conclusion. Like, it is really interesting to learn about, whether it's clinically relevant. We're still figuring out. There are certain
If you have a
cases where
frozen shoulder, it's clinically relevant. If you have adhesive capsulitis, it's clinically relevant because it's the adhesions in the capsule that are restricting the range of motion, and
but just for normal movement.
Well, I don't know. What does Bernie say? You talk to Bernie. He's got opinions on this stuff. You have opinions on Yin Yoga in the book, as I recall.
Yeah. And this is one thing where Bernie, I think, have a bit of healthy disagreement.
Yes.
And I remember him even having a blog post where he said, I don't think the authors of the physiology of yoga quite understood, etc. But I really like that respectful disagreement. And these are things where we're not quite sure. But Bernie, what he says is basically, that if we hold a pose for longer, that affects the connective tissue more so than the muscles. And in our myth or fact sidebar, we asked the question, does yin yoga affect the fascia, the connective tissue, more than the muscles? And it's so interrelated that you can't really tease one apart from the other. So I think maybe it doesn't, but also, does that matter? Would we want to stretch our fascia more than other things? How would that be beneficial? Like, what effect would that have? And if you just look at yin, which is a beautiful practice, it's a great practice. If you are spending an hour doing yin, you do maybe 6 poses or something. Is that the best use of your time? It might be, but if you're doing that, then you're not doing something else. So, which means you're not doing strength training. You're not doing time with your family, So we have to decide, how do I want to spend my time? Like always, that cost benefit analysis. And you do yin. I would say,
yeah.
What I always say is, do yin if you love yin. Don't do yin because you feel like you need to because of your fascia. And I think the real benefit for me is not in the fascia. I think it's in down-regulating your autonomic nervous system and, calming down, taking time out of your life. And it's great for that. It's so valuable for that.
Well, if you spend a lot of time doing yang stuff, yin is a great counterbalance. I think that accounts for a lot of its popularity because of all the decades people have spent jumping around in hot vinyasa type practice. You would think that an energetic counterpoint to that would become necessary at a certain stage in people's practice or understanding their bodies or whatever. One of the things I liked about the Sivananda practice was that you do shavasana between all the poses, right?
Yeah.
And so you're really taking the time to absorb the, for lack of a better term, energetic effects of what you have just done. How does my shavasana feel after doing shoulder stand and plow? How does it feel after doing a back bend? How does it feel after doing a forward bend? How does it feel after doing each of the things in that sequence? The twists and whatever. And so that to me is kind of a bit of a lost method. If all you've ever experienced is the fast-paced vinyasa flow kind of thing. So, yeah, and what you bring up an interesting thing, as you said, about down-regulating the autonomic nervous system, and this is where a big bucket of mystery comes into it from the scientific perspective, because now you're talking about how consciousness and intention interacts with all of your systems when you're practicing. Now you're getting into the realm of, let's just say, neuro, psycho, emotional, immune response kinds of stuff, which, we're barely at the point where we know the right questions to ask, let alone getting solid answers on all of this, because someone's intention and how their consciousness is interacting with what they're doing and how that's affecting not just their autonomic nervous system, but their immune and inflammatory responses and the whole range of things that are interpenetrated with your nervous system. It's a huge aspect for people, and we don't have some good answers to give people, scientifically at this point. All we know is that there are people out there whose MRIs, if you take them at face value, would tell you that they should be in a wheelchair and they're out there doing all kinds of stuff. And there's other people whose imaging looks completely normal, who are in chronic, debilitating, life-altering pain, right? So what you can sort of scientifically verify by, imaging studies is just a fraction of the picture when it comes to a human being and how well or poorly they can function in this world. So there's a lot of mystery that goes into it. Look at a guy like David Goggins, he's got no knees left. He's out there and he runs ultra marathons, and he's in excruciating pain, but he's dealt with it. It's just part of what he deals with to do what he does and be who he is. How do you explain someone like that?
Mm-mm. Yeah. Just in case any listeners aren't familiar with what you're referring to, so there was a big systematic review, Jinkji, if I remember the name correctly. I think it was in 2015. They reviewed all of the evidence on MRI findings of healthy asymptomatic people. So these are people who would not normally have imaging because they're healthy. Exactly. They have no reason to get an image. And the vast majority of people had something that would appear wrong and be blamed for someone having pain. So people would have disc herniations with absolutely no pain, rotator cuff tears with no pain, meniscal tears in the knee with no pain. So
labral tears, all of it. Yes, all of it. Yeah. Neuromas. In fact, my most recent blog post is dealing with that. It's going to be a series of blog posts that kind of deal with that whole issue, which was famously brought into the public discussion by Dr. John Sarno, who wrote a very influential book called Healing Back Pain, where he suggests that the way people handle their emotional lives have a lot more to do with whether they're in pain or not than their imaging studies, Yeah,
the biopsychosocial model and how all of those, not just biology, not just whether you have arthritis, some cartilage degeneration, or whether you have a disc herniation, but also psychological factors, social factors go into pain. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And something like fibromyalgia, by definition, which literally fibro refers to connective tissue, myo, muscle, and algia, pain. So you're basically just saying musculoskeletal connective tissue pain. That's it. And the way you get diagnosed is that everything else gets excluded. So it's a diagnosis of exclusion.
Yes. Anything else that can explain this person's pain has been ruled out because all the other tests are normal, yet they're in excruciating pain. Boom, fibromyalgia, which is basically the medical profession saying, you're a head case. And, there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on with these things with people. But that's just one. A lot of diagnoses are merely descriptions of people's symptoms in Latin, If you go into an orthopedist and say, oh, I have pain here, and it flares up when I play golf, and they do the exam and the whole thing, and maybe they'll do some imaging. And then after all of that, they say, yeah, you have medial epicondylitis. Well, that's basically saying in Latin what you told the doctor. I have pain here on the medial epicondyle. This happens all the time. A true diagnosis actually gives you some idea of what created the pain in the first place and what a possible therapeutic resolution might look like to deal with the source of the pain or what caused it biomechanically. And this is where it's kind of ironic that, people come to us yoga teachers and we're not physical therapists. We're not orthopedists. We're not physiatrists. We're not osteopaths. We're just yoga teachers. But if you spend enough time with enough people and pay attention and listen, you begin to see some things about how they're moving and how they're walking and how they're putting weight on their arms. And you give them a few ideas of how to do it differently and how to breathe. And all of a sudden they feel better, And that's not something you're going to get from an orthopedic consultation. You're going to know whether or not you're a candidate for surgery or a steroid injection or something like that. But when people come to us for help, it's usually because they've exhausted some of those avenues and they're still having problems. And what we can do is help them focus on what's going right. Not that we're experts on everything that's gone wrong, but it's like, yeah, you can still move, you can still breathe, you can still do these poses. Let's see if we can give you some ideas of how to maybe adapt them so that you can be in less pain and do the things you want to be doing in life.
That's exactly what I say on a teacher training. If I'm leading the anatomy component on teacher training, and I'll say, okay, so what does this yoga teacher training prepare you to do? And it's such an obvious set, it does what it says on the tin, to teach yoga. Okay, what about to help someone in pain? No, not necessarily. Or, what about to cure someone of a certain condition? No. It is just literally to teach yoga. And normally in a group setting, that's what this yoga teacher training does. And yet, there's so much more to that. Of course, it's a magical practice, but really, we just need to focus on my job is to teach a really good, amazing class, make you feel amazing in your body, hopefully. And one other thing, just about pain, quite often people will tell me before class, I've got this knee pain, this hip pain, whatever. And, I'll say, okay, just see how things go. I might offer a few suggestions or something. But quite often they just do everything and they're absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like, I didn't need to know that information because you did everything. You were absolutely fine. And it can be really empowering, I think, for that person to have that knee pain and to do the entire class and realize, okay, it wasn't so bad, actually.
Absolutely. And there are some things that would be nice to know. Like, you ask people beforehand if there's anything you should know about their bodies and they don't say anything. And then halfway through, you spot someone that's moving a little weirdly and you go, what's going on here? And they go, oh yeah, I have rods in my spine, or, it's like
hip replacement. I forgot to tell you.
It's not in the front of their mind, necessarily. They've been living their lives. And, that's what I always tell people. When this conversation comes up most frequently, it's when I'm asking people to fully articulate their spines, which includes some spinal flexion. And then the red flags go off because they've been told, oh, I have osteopenia, I have osteoporosis, my spine is going to collapse if I do that because I've been told flexion is bad. And I go, okay, we're going to have this conversation yet again, like, how did you get your shoes off in the waiting room to get in this room? Were you able to do that without some spinal flexion? Did your spine explode when you put your pants on this morning? These are natural movements of the spine. You're going to be more harmed by the fear you've been given of doing these natural movements than the movements themselves. And we're going to ask you to do things consciously, intentionally, with your breath that will produce some healthy weight-bearing forces in the bones of your spine, which is what they need in order to be strong. You mentioned Wolff's Law in the book, right? Mm-hmm. Where bone responds by getting stronger when you put healthy loads into it. It gets weaker when you take load away from it. So the question is, how do you produce healthy loading? How do you avoid unhealthy loading? It's not never do that movement. It kind of makes me nuts when people come in having been given this advice by somebody who clearly didn't try it themselves. People that are willing to tell folks never to do spinal flexion should be willing to live one day of their lives doing exactly that and see how it feels and see what state it puts your nervous system in. Talk about, autonomic nervous system. It puts you in this fight or flight kind of situation where you're afraid of your own body, where you're afraid of natural movements. So that's a big debunking thing that's happening all the time when people come in with these sort of fear-mongering restrictions they've been given.
Yeah, and there are, evidence-based guidelines and evidence-based best practices, and those very regularly say to keep moving if you have back pain, to do as much as you can to move your spine through all different ranges of motion. There's been some really interesting research on physical therapists and medical practitioners and how they actually don't always follow these best practice evidence-based guidelines. And a lot of physical therapists, for example, something around 50%, even without intending to, will share beliefs that are not aligned with evidence-based practices, including telling people to maintain a flat back, a neutral spine as much as possible.
Yeah.
So even in those, without meaning to, we can share these fear-based beliefs about rounding the back and stuff. Yeah. So I totally hear you on that.
Yeah. And well, in yoga, that's rampant. I mean, this idea of finding tadasana and all the asanas, it locks people into this neutral spine thing. And then they wonder why their hip joints are wearing out. Because, like all the movement now has to come from, I said earlier, that's the definition of unhealthy movement. Too much movement from too few places. Repeat that too many times. You've got repetitive stress and After all those years of keeping a neutral spine and trying to square your pelvis, you're putting all that burden on the hip joints. And, I just came from the Berkshire Yoga Festival this past weekend, and a lot of, senior teachers, friends and colleagues of many years are there. And I'm not going to mention any names, but a lot of the conversation was like, when's your hip replacement schedule? When's the next one going? And it's just rampant. You see it so much of, enough years of doing this. It overburdens the hip joints for so many people.
Yes. Although, to challenge you a little bit there, we don't know if that person would have needed a hip replacement if they had not been a yogi, because we only have that one
it's
individual.
Sample size of one, obviously, and you don't have an A, B on the same person. What would their hips look like if they hadn't done that? And yet, have you had Jill Miller on the program?
No, not yet. I've listened to a podcast with her, but not yet.
Where she talks about her hip replacement?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was just...
Oh, did she in the podcast? I don't know.
Yeah. So she'll be very upfront and honest about how she's absolutely certain that the way she abused her yoga practice led to her needing a hip replacement,
Right.
And so, and you'll hear this from a number of people who absolutely recognize that they destabilized their pelvic structure with the way they were practicing. And so, again, this is anecdotal from their own life and their own experience. And if you want to be super skeptical, you can say, yes, but maybe you were predisposed to this. Maybe you had shallow acetabula. Maybe something else would have made it necessary even without the yoga. But I can definitely say, from having taught yoga and had these conversations, and also being a body worker who works with his hands on people, there are certain ideas that have been promoted about how you align yourself in asana that are, let us just say, counterproductive to long-term hip joint health. And when you point it out and show people alternatives, and all of a sudden they feel the difference in the pressure that's coming to bear on the hip joints, or the less pressure that's coming to bear on the hip joints, you can see that there are healthier ways of thinking about getting into and out of some of these poses. So
is that what you focus on in your classes and in your work with people privately? Is making the asana more comfortable, would you say?
Yeah. And we focus a lot on the feet. You have to go to the feet. There's no way that you can't bring it back to the foundation of what it takes to be a healthy biped when you're teaching alignment. And one thing I do agree with in the Iyengar way of teaching is I think standing poses are an absolutely sort of essential starting point for opening the conversation about alignment, because of us being bipeds. And there's an ethos that comes out of my teacher's way of looking at things. And I don't know if I ever heard Desikachar say this in so many words, but the way he taught is absolutely consistent with it. And that is that if you can produce even a little bit of positive change in something a person does a lot of, that will add up over time to a lot of positive change. And so that's why when you study with me, you'll hear me talking a lot about standing and walking, about the feet, because we do a lot of that, and breathing. We do a lot of breathing. So if you can produce even a little bit of positive change in the way someone's breathing, that will add up to an enormous amount of change over time. And the same is true of standing and walking. And so I consider arm supports, for example, to be intermediate level skills from that perspective. Because unless you can understand how you're weight bearing on your feet, which are the structures that have evolved specifically for that purpose, you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding how to make this thing be a weight bearing appendage, it's evolved away from being a weight bearing structure, whereas your feet are those structures. So that's my perspective anyway. Amy, by the way, disagrees. Amy Matthews, my co-author, takes a very developmental approach. And she's like, well, what about the fact that babies are bearing weight on their upper extremities before they learn to stand and walk? And so and I 100% agree with and respect that perspective as well. And she will teach classes from that perspective, where she has people starting on the floor and evolving through, various developmental stages, whether it's from an evolutionary perspective or a developmental perspective, and she'll have them on their hands and moving around, and you'll end up on your feet having passed through the weight-bearing stage on the upper extremities. So I'm not saying that my view is the only correct view. It's just one that I found very useful in teaching. There are other approaches for sure.
Yeah, and I might disagree with you on certain points about alignment also. Like I just led a workshop called Alignment Doesn't Prevent Injury, so what should we do instead? About how our bodies are extremely variable, how we have lots of different ways of doing the same thing. And though biomechanics or how you rather align yourself will affect the biomechanics of your body, that doesn't necessarily predict injury that reliably. And people have tried to do this with things like the functional movement screen, where you do about 6 movements and you're assessed on how quote unquote good your movements are, with like standard ideas of what we think of as a good movement. Like if you squat, can you keep your back relatively flat, relatively neutral, and can you keep your heels on the floor? And yet the research just doesn't back up how good someone's movement is, quote unquote good, in terms of their prediction of injury risk. I think a bit of healthy disagreement is good. And
I don't know if we disagree, because it depends how you define alignment. If you're defining alignment as the catechism of cueing that people learn when they become yoga instructors, I agree, that's not going to keep you safe. But if alignment is simply finding the clearest possible pathway of weight through your skeletal structure and joint space, which will differ for each and every person, that's, I think, where we can find agreement, right? Because alignment for most people who are trained to teach is simply memorizing the cueing for each and every pose and trying to get the students to execute it. So the thing I say is poses don't have alignment. People have alignment, right? And what's even deeper behind that statement is the reason poses don't have alignment, the reason asanas don't have alignment, is that asanas actually don't exist. There's no such thing as an asana that you can take out of a human being and look at and describe its properties. It's like this Platonic idealism, which people are operating off of, which has no relationship to actual human bodies. An asana only exists in the universe when a real, live, individual human body puts that body into a shape, and then you can have a discussion about what is the best alignment for that person in that shape. But the way that the cueing has developed actually is more of this Platonic idealism, where this is the alignment for this pose, this is the alignment for that pose, and then in order to teach it and keep the people safe, you have to teach them to do the alignment for the pose. So I think we may be in agreement if that's what you mean by alignment.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. And I remember you saying that in a video about how poses don't have alignment. And just to say, which reminds me from 20 years ago, before Instagram, before TikTok and everything, you were putting stuff up on YouTube. And I think that's how I first found out about you, and saying stuff like that, which would really make me change how I thought about yoga. This idea of like poses don't have alignment, humans don't have alignment. So you were really ahead of your time in putting those things up on YouTube, which is great. But also I think you had some these really interesting things in a different way, which is really useful for a yoga practitioner.
I think so. And all that comes out of the fact that, both Amy and I come from a background in philosophy as well. She studied it formally in college. I never made it to college, but I have been studying it quite seriously all of my life. And, when you develop sort of a functional epistemology, meaning what in reality your concepts are connected to, whether you're coming at things from a Platonic point of view or, for lack of a better term, a more Aristotelian point of view, and so it's the Platonic thing that I was just describing that gets us into trouble with the alignment conversation, because it's this idealism, like the world of forms that Plato described. And if your asana kind of lives there and your goal in practice is to approach that ideal form as much as possible, I think that's what's getting in people in trouble, whether they realize it or not, that's where they're coming from. But to have your idea of alignment arising from reality itself, and have it connected to the reality of each person's human body. And this is where yin, by the way, and the work that Bernie does, and Paul's gallery of bones and all of that, showing all of the variation that exists in people's bodies, and the alignment of their joints and the orientation of their hip sockets and all of that. That's a grounding in reality that we all need if we're going to evolve a useful way of teaching something like asana and using a concept like alignment. So I think there's a Venn diagram where your perspective and mine and Bernie's and Paul's really do come together, and where they intersect is, let's look at reality and use that as a starting point for a conversation.
Yeah, I like it. I like it how you talk about that. How do you see asana as this one perfect thing to pursue, or individual to each person? And it's interesting that you say that, because just a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you saw this, but there was like the first annual kind of yoga Olympic Games. Not Olympic, but did you see this yoga competition?
I've been seeing crap like that for years. There's a tradition in India of yoga competitions, and then Bikram took it up and turned it into a thing, and they wanted it to become an Olympic event at one point. And I did a whole video criticizing that perspective. That's on YouTube as well, And I was like, you know what? If it's something that even a moderately well-trained gymnast can do with no background in yoga and do a performance like that, it's not its own thing. It's gymnastics is what it is. And I'm always wondering what it has to do with actual yoga, but you have to make the case what asana has to do with yoga from that perspective as well, and so, that's a conversation. It's like a lot of what we call yoga is actually asana, and what its relation is to the broader perspective and philosophy and objectives of yoga is a really important question.
Yeah, I always say, yoga is not what you're doing with your body, it's what you're doing with your mind. So it doesn't exactly matter what you're doing with your body. So a handstand can be yoga. Lying down doing nothing can be yoga. It's where your mind is. But it is interesting, you and I, two white guys in the West, talking about yoga, which comes from the East, from India, and yet India is where these yoga games are happening. So I don't know, it's this interesting combination, isn't it? Of the place where at least the philosophy of yoga originated, and now we're seeing this kind of just one perfect form of yoga. And there is like a right or wrong in these yoga games of, this is the right way of doing the pose, this is the wrong way. So yeah, it's interesting, I think.
Sure, but there is a right and wrong way of doing any technique. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a technique. So,
Sure.
When right and wrong enters a conversation, it's important to keep it in perspective. We're talking about the execution of a technique, whether it's Kapalabhati or Trikonasana, and there is a place for that, so long as it doesn't overwhelm or exclude the inquiry aspect of what we're using the pose for. But that's the sthira and sukha of the conversation of teaching. The sthira, the structure, is the technique. And there is a right and a wrong to that. The sukha, the space where the inquiry happens, there is no right and wrong, because an inquiry is whatever you come up with when you contemplate what your experience is attempting this technique. And I'm always pointing that out to the teachers in my workshops is, you need to understand this dynamic and make sure there's a balance of that when you're teaching. We've all been in situations where there's way too much technique to the point where it feels like there's no room for your experience. Just as you can be in a class where it seems like there's no technique. It's all about rolling around on the floor and just feeling what you're feeling. And it's like, what are we actually learning here? There has to be a balance at some point.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said in my alignment doesn't prevent injury workshop, is just that. If yoga is just, feeling good in your body, like we're just rolling around, exactly that. So how do we define? There is a warrior two, and what warrior two looks like. And if you've got a limp wrist, it's not warrior two. nothing wrong with your wrist going soft. Like,
Look,
that's not a bad
right,
movement.
you're in
Like,
Warrior
in Warrior
One.
2, there's
This is Warrior One. This is a warrior. This is surrender.
for the listeners.
Giving up.
What do you for the people who can't see you, Leslie? What are you doing?
So I'm holding my arms up with my palms facing each other, which is what they do in Warrior One, and that's strong. That's Virabhadra. That's a warrior, right? But if I just turn my wrists 90 degrees and point my palms forward, this warrior is giving up. He's surrendering, right? So yes, there is a relationship between gesture and shape and asana and the name of the asana and the energy behind it. And at a certain point, it stops being what it is when you vary it enough. So the question is, what is the core of what we're trying to accomplish here? And you can then make variations or adaptations or modifications as long as you understand the function that you're going after. My teacher would always say this. Desikachar was a structural engineer before he was a yoga teacher. But this could have been said by either one, that the form of a pose must serve its function. Just like the form of a bridge must serve its function. You can build a beautiful bridge that falls down, and it's not a very good bridge, right? So there is all of that. And to be fair, with the yoga competition demonstration thing, Krishnamacharya, was someone who put on yoga demonstrations, and he had these young boys demonstrating for him, the perfection of the poses. And when he ran out of young boys to demonstrate, because they all ran away one by one because his discipline was so abusive, there was only one person left who couldn't run away. His name was BKS Iyengar, and he was Krishnamacharya's brother-in-law. And he started training him up. And that ended up, making him want to run away to Pune, where he could practice on his own and develop his own system. So demonstration has always been a part of this in the tradition, because it's how you got people's attention. It's how you show them what is possible. So, it's not just us people in the West, putting on shows. This is something that's been happening for a while.
Yeah. So one last question, Leslie, because I know it's getting to be an hour. You've got to move your car for New York parking, right?
Alternate side parking here in New York City, yes.
So, we've talked a bit about what yoga is not. Just one last question. In a few words, for you, what is yoga?
What is yoga? I would just have to go with, yoga practice. I think the most practical, useful discussion around yoga practice comes to us from the first sutra on the chapter about practice in Patanjali, which is tapas swadhyaya ishvara pranidhana, right? Because that's the definition of Kriya Yoga. And so what that tells us is that tapas has to do with inducing a change in the system outside of its ordinary way of functioning. It's producing some friction against your habits. Tapas is a kind of friction because it means to heat or to purify by heat or to cook, And so this is about changing the things that are changeable in your system from maybe habitual way of operating to something a little more conscious. It also tells us that there are certain things that are not changeable that we can't change, which by their nature are outside of our ability to control. And so that's telling us that the attitude towards that aspect of our existence is to surrender. That's the Ishvara Pranidhana. But it also tells us that there's this principle of swadhyaya, which is the inquiry, the self-inquiry, the ability to focus on the difference between the things we can change and the things we can't. And this is absolutely 100% the serenity prayer. This is asking for the strength to change the things you can, and to accept the things you cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana. And
that's right.
And the really powerful perspective on this that comes from my teacher is that the breath is at the center of this conversation, because breathing is both voluntary, we can change it, we can manipulate it. It's also involuntary. We have to surrender to that fact as well. And so we have a built-in teacher of yoga in our system, and it's called the breath. And when you do swadhyaya on the breathing, it teaches you yoga. It teaches you this principle of tapas, swadhyaya, and Ishvara pranidhana. So that, to me, is the most practical, useful lens through which to view this topic of yoga. There's a lot of other interpretations of yoga, obviously. The first chapter of Patanjali, it's all about samadhi, There's this idea of yoking, of joining. Just you look at the word itself, yuj. So there's a lot of conversation to be had, but for me, that's the most practical one.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that. I like how you tie it to the serenity prayer. That's really nice.
And
And
breathing,
if we can, accept the things that we cannot change, that'd be such a huge thing. Yeah.
That's
Really
the
nice
hard
way to end
tapas
there.
of all. That itself is tapas. They all spin on each other, and that's I think the beauty of some of these teachings is that they're really derived from our own anatomy, from our own physiology, from the fact that we're breathing. We are these breathing conscious creatures, and immediately that involves us in this conversation between the relationship between that which is voluntary and that which is automatic or autonomic. So it's a great conversation to have.
Yeah. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," but he could have also said, "I breathe, therefore I am." Right?
Said a lot of things that would not have led to this Cartesian mind-body split. I write about that in some of my recent blog posts, so people can find them at lesliekaminoff.yoga.
Right. Leslie Kaminoff. And so if people do want to study with you more, follow you, what should they do?
lesliekaminoff.yoga. That's the platform that we put all of my stuff on now, including the courses and the blog posts and just everything, archives from over the years. It's all there.
Yeah, you have some great blog posts. I definitely recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going old school with the blog posts these days.
Good. All right. Thank you very much for taking the time today, Leslie. It's really been great to chat with you. So
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And next time I'm in London, we should get together and hang out a bit.
That'd be great. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Which reminds me of this story that I wanted to mention briefly. I remember years and years ago, I was teacher at Tri Yoga, and this was on the days of Twitter, and said, "Oh, Tri Yoga, you should bring Leslie Kaminoff for a workshop there because you'd never been to Tri Yoga." And then a year later, you were there, so I think I'd like to take credit for you.
Someone listening. Either it was Jonathan or Jenny or someone, but I ended up there, and yeah. And London is, other than New York, it's probably my favorite city in the world. So I look forward to coming back at some point.
It's nice. Especially in the summer. Don't come in January, February, but in the summer it's nice.
The fall is usually when I go there. That's pretty good too.
It
is
nice.
All right, man.
All right. Thank you very much, Leslie. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. It's great to connect.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. So that was the end of that episode. Really hope you enjoyed it. A couple of things that stood out for me. The simple saying, poses don't have alignment, people do. So rather than, chasing this perfect ideal alignment, focusing on what the person in front of you is doing, I think is a great idea. And all of the people I speak to and all seem to come to the same conclusion that critical thinking really matters in this day and age more than certainty. And yoga is inquiry, not the pursuit of perfect poses. And something that has stayed with me a few days after interviewing Leslie was his definition of yoga, or what it means to him, and how it is that balance of having the strength to change the things we can change, to accept the things we cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference, which you find, I think, in many different philosophies, whether they're religious or not. So that's maybe something you can carry with you. What are the things that I can change in my own life? What are the things that I just need to surrender to? And how can I get better at knowing the difference? Thank you again for tuning in. And it would really mean a lot if you could please leave a 5-star review and rating, or 5-star rating and a review as it goes. It really helps the discoverability and helping other people finding this podcast. And please do share it. I'm working really hard along with my assistant, Cheska, to help produce these regularly. So if you could share them, put up a story on your Instagram or whatever, just take a screenshot of what you're watching right now, listening to, and put it up on your social media. I'll be sure to share that. It will mean the world to me. You can find me on Instagram as Yoga with Matt. All right, so thank you very much, and see you next time. Cue the outro music.
Thank you for listening to the Enlightened Anatomy podcast. We would be grateful if you would leave a review and a 5-star rating. Be sure to tune in next time for more science-based knowledge to get enlightened and help others.
Do you wish you felt more confident in your yoga teaching or even your yoga practice? Or do you worry about saying the wrong thing about alignment or injury? Well, you're not alone, and that's why I created 5 truth bombs to make you a more confident yoga teacher. It's a free mini ebook packed with science-based insights to bust myths, teach smarter, and build trust with your clients. There's no fluff to it. It's just practical, evidence-based advice to elevate your teaching. And you can get your copy right now by going to my website, matthewhuey.com/5. So long as you're not driving, go ahead and do it right now. Go to matthewhuey.com/5. Either the numeral or the letters, both will get you there, and you'll get my free mini ebook. And let me know what you think. Now back to the episode. After you've done the little, website thing first.